Hello, students, faculty, staff, alumni, and others who participate in any of the following seminar with their camera on or use a profile image are agreeing to have their video or image recorded solely for the purpose of creating a record for participants in this seminar to refer to, including those enrolled students who are unable to attend live. If you are unwilling to consent to have your profile or video image recorded, be sure to keep your camera off and do not use a profile image. Likewise, participants who unmute during the seminar or class and participate orally are agreeing to have their voices recorded. If you are not willing to consent to have your voice recorded, you will need to keep your mute button activated and communicate exclusively using the chat feature, which allows participants to type questions and comments live.
Okay, good. So let me introduce the speaker. We have two speakers today with us. First, Nobel Laureate Professor Finn Kydland, and also Carlos Zarazaga, who is going to present in collaboration with Finn with us. I thought that Finn will present. This is why I prepared a few remarks about my friend and mentor and really my teacher, Professor Finn Kydland. So Finn is a Norwegian economist known for his contribution to business cycle theory. He's currently the Henley Professor of Economics at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Again, born in Norway, as we said, and he's a Nobel Laureate for contribution to dynamic macroeconomic, the time consistency of economic policy, and the driving forces behind business cycles. He got it with another friend of ours, Ed Prescott, who was his teacher. So Finn was a student of Ed Prescott. And I just discovered that a few hours ago that he was influenced by David Cass and Joseph Schumter, in addition to his work with Ed Prescott. Professor Kydland joined the US Santa Barbara faculty in July 2004 and appointed the Jeff Henley Chair in Economics. He previously taught at Carnegie Mellon University. This is where he did his dissertation under Prescott, where he earned his PhD. He's a native of Norway, as we said. He earned his bachelor degree in the Norwegian School of Economics and Business Administration. Ed Prescott today, as we all know, moved from the University of Minnesota to Arizona State University. Professor Kydland is a research associate of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. This is where he started, I assume, collaborating with Carlos, who is now at SMU, has been a visitor professor at universities in 6 countries. His honor and awards include the John Stauffer National Fellowship in Public Policy from the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace at Stanford University. And Lilia, I didn't connect the fact that he was there with your PhD. I should have thought about it. Finn Kydland is a fellow of the Econometric Society since 1992. What else I can tell you about him? His dissertation under Edward Prescott is titled Decentralized Macroeconomic Planning. After his PhD, he returned to Norway, and then he moved to, in 1978, he moved to Carnegie Mellon and stayed there for a long time until moving to California. His areas of expertise are macroeconomics, political economy, business cycle, maybe the father of business cycle with Ed Prescott, monetary fiscal policy, and labor economics. I met Professor Kydland, so this is where I'm talking about you and me in some respect. I met Professor Kydland as a student in his course at the University of Minnesota when he was visiting from Carnegie Mellon. We met again in many places, among them Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, which we all remember, in Fresno, California, when we spent a few remarkable days, I think, in few of the best known USA national parks. We also spent a few days and nights in Paris, France, and elsewhere. We are together also involved in a new initiative headquartered in Madrid, Spain. As far as his co-author, Nobel Laureate Ed Prescott, Ed served as a member of my PhD dissertation at the University of Minnesota, with Nobel Laureate Tom Sargent as a chairman, of my PhD thesis. Now Sargent is at NYU with Nobel laureate Chris Sims, which is now at Princeton, moved from Minnesota to Princeton, together with Professor Neil Wallace, which I'm always pushing his name because I think he really deserves Finn recognition and I think the Nobel Prize. Today, Finn and Carlos are going to present his paper exploring the role of limited commitment constraint in Argentina missing capital. He's doing it with both Marek Kapička, who is from the Czech Republic, and Carlos, who were, as I mentioned before, at Dallas Fed and now at SMU. One comment about James Ekman, who presented last week. We are going to have another session with him. I'm planning it for the 23rd of December. He still wants to combine his group from Denmark in order to make sure that all of them will be on, including our Miles. So please stay tuned for this announcement. Again, I'm planning it for the 23rd of December at about 11 a.m. Finn and Carlos, thank you very much. I appreciate your presence here.
May I just say a few words about
Sure.
so Yohanan, I was on, as Yohanan said, I was at the University of Minnesota for a year, and they have this sequence of macro courses, 3-quarter courses, and then Chris Sims was supposed to teach the last of them, but he got funding so he could buy himself out. And so then the then chairman, Jim Simler, organized for me to take over. And this was a great class. So in addition to Yohanan, in that class was Ayagari, Zvi Eckstein, Marty Eichenbaum. I remember Marty Eichenbaum he was hired by Carnegie Mellon as his first job. And sometimes I would joke with him and I said, Marty, you forgot everything I taught you in your classes. Anyway, so I taught Yohanan everything from Banach spaces to the inapplicability of optimal control for policymaking. It was a great class, and I really appreciated teaching it. And I still have my notes from that class, but
including my examination, right?
I was going to go back and check, but they're actually located at my office at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, so they're hard to get to. But I still have them in the folder there. What I remember was keeping you may remember the big homework assignment about the Great Fish War it was kind of Iceland versus Norway, and it turned out to be a situation you could model as a dynamic, non-cooperative game. And it was a challenging project. And I remember keeping the answer from Markus Möller, the Icelandic student who just wrote a fantastic answer to that question. So I don't know what happened to him. He seems to have disappeared from academia. If you know, then I'd be curious to know. Anyway, Yohanan and I go back a long time, as he pointed out, and I'm grateful for this invitation to me and to my two co-authors, Carlos Zarazaga, with whom I've worked since 1995, and when he first joined the Dallas Fed, and of course Marek Kapička, who is located in Praha.
Good. So let's move on. Carlos, go ahead.
All right. With these Zoom presentations, and I should have to say good morning, good evening, or good night. But thank you, Johanna for inviting us to present this paper. I want to reiterate that this is a joint project with Finn and with Marek Kapička, who is present in this Zoom meeting. I know there are a bunch of grad students. We got the questions, but a little late. So during my presentation, I hopefully address some of them. And if I don't, I guess we have time at the end to address them. So by the way, Johanna, what's the time frame?
You have time until 1:45 New York time, which is like, I don't know,
like an hour and a half.
80 minutes ago, 80 minutes to go, yes.
Okay, and then there will be Q&A or?
Whatever you want. We will shout at the middle. Everyone can be unmuted, and then at the end, if you have time.
Okay, so but if we want Q&A, then I have to plan to finish at 1:45 your time?
Let's say 1:40 or 1:35 my time.
Okay, all right. Okay, so we started this project. Let me share the screen.
For all the audience, we put the slides on the internet, so you can download it to yourself if you.
What happened? My Zoom went away.
That's okay. Take your time.
Yeah. Trying to magnify this. I don't know what happened. Oh, okay. I had minimized it accidentally.
Don't tell me you're worse than me. I mean, the reason I'm not doing this is that everyone knows I'm technologically challenged, so it would be a disaster if I tried to do it.
Yeah, well, that was a fluke thing. Like the many I committed during this project. But anyway, so hello, Marek. How you doing?
How are you?
Fine. So everybody, this is Marek, our co-author, watching
Hello,
from
everyone.
Praga. Okay. So we are going to talk about Argentina, my home country, by the way. And since you were talking about all these important people, I went to Minnesota. My thesis advisor was Chris Sims. He was the chair, but he had in the committee also Ed Prescott. And since you were talking about Neil Wallace, also Neil Wallace, Johanan, and I agree totally with you. He's underappreciated in the profession.
Finn, you have to lobby him. I don't see you, Finn, but you have to lobby for him. This is really injustice, you know.
No, I agree. I agree. I mean, obviously, I interacted with a lot when I was there that year in the department, and I even sat in on his course. I mean, he is a great economist.
And I can tell you that Zvi Grilik has told me many times that, you know, Neil Wallace is, you know, as good as and better than Bob Lucas. So, and again, his ideas are amazing. So everyone benefited from him, Sargent and Sims and Horowitz at the time.
Yep.
Okay, so I move on then to the presentation. So, well, what was this project inspired by? Is essentially evidence for Argentina. Starting, as I said, I'm from Argentina. I have been in the States for 35 years now, but I still have a concern for my own country. And this is what in a project we worked many years ago with Finn. We found this, that the capital output ratio, which is in, this is not the capital output ratio, but the capital output ratio declined because you can see that the red line, that the trended capital stock collapsed since 1980s. And that's not justified by the behavior of TP. By the way, these are all the trended variables. We're going to talk about how we detrended. But of course, there is an upward trend. But when you detrend the variables, you realize that the capital stock declined quite a bit. And that implied that the capital output ratio in 2008 was nearly 20% lower than in 1980. So it's a rather dramatic decline. And that's what we call the missing capital. What happened? Why did Argentina suddenly had this capital shallowing process. And that's the question we're after. And
Carlos, I have a question to you. What about the black market in Argentina? I don't know enough about Argentina, but maybe partially it's black market activities.
You mean the underground economy?
Yes.
Yeah, well, we don't have any way to control that, but the underground economy, by definition, has very low. It's very low. It doesn't have a lot of capital intensity. It's just small shops. If they were big, they will be detected. So the capital intensity in the informal sector is very low. And from my knowledge of Argentina's data, I'm almost certain that it will make no difference for this evidence.
What about capital flight?
Well, that's what in part what this paper is about. So exactly that's the question we're asking. And so first we examine, so as I said, kind of a reference point in time is 1980s, where, you know, and so you look at the trended output. There was a default in 1982, but, you know, it's not that it was a particularly large decline. So it was a decline. But then when you look at what happened with the trended capital, you can see that the decline, the default happened when Argentina had the capital stock. And this is, again, the trended capital stock near its peak. So what is the conventional wisdom is that countries don't default out of opportunistic considerations, but mostly out of necessity in bad times. And that's the common view inspired by endowment economy models. So it's like, you know, you have a low realization of endowment. It's not a fault of your own. So you are entitled to pay less to foreigners, and they understand that. You are in the dire straits, and they will let you, of course, smooth out consumption and then renegotiate the debt. But the assessment of these justifiable defaults is not always easy to defend once we abandon the endowment economy and we go to an economy with capital. Because, and this is known, the country with a higher capital stock is coming from abroad, we have always the temptation to seize the capital. And particularly when you have a lot of capital, then you can say, okay, I don't need to pay back the debt. I can live out forever out of the capital accumulated, or these people pour into the country. Although that comes associated with contractual obligations, I'm not going to honor them, and I'm going to have more consumption. And therefore, there's a temptation for opportunistic default. And as in the chart I showed before, Argentina's economic conditions were not that dismal when it defaulted in 1982. No, the capital stock was near as a peak. So this is not a sub-Saharan African country that had a bad crop. They have a decent amount of capital. So the motivation and the goal of the paper is that the fact that Argentina defaulted when a capital stock was at historical high may have convinced investors that Argentina is a country that cannot be trusted. And from thereafter, Argentina started to operate with limited commitment constraints, meaning the investors at that time realized, well, if we give these high guys too much capital, they confiscate it. Therefore, there's an upper bound on how much investment we're willing to make into that country. And so going to your question, Johanna, there really is no need for capital flight. You just, what happens, you don't get any flows, capital depreciates, and then because you don't have access to international capital markets, it's costly to accumulate capital. And so naturally, capital stock will go down just by depreciation.
What about the political economy? In other words, when you default, does the government fall, or does the government get more votes?
That's a good question. We don't mess around with that directly. We mess around with that indirectly in the way we're going to show it.
Hey, Carlos, I had a question too.
Sure.
Hi,
Sanjita, by the way.
Hi, how are you? In 1982, Mexico also defaulted on their public debt. Now, to the best of my knowledge, but I could be wrong, we don't see this decline in the secular decline in capital stock in Mexico. Now, one could argue that these are countries working under similar constraints. So do you have any sense of why these experiences would be different?
Well, no, I think Tim Kehoe and Hal Cole and Tim Kehoe have written about it, and they attribute it to self-fulfilling prophecies. This is, we are not taking a stand on what happened in Mexico because we don't know what happened with the capital stock.
Well, it's a TFP story there. It's not a fall in capital stock story.
Right.
So that's what made me wonder that, if anything, I see Argentina as a country with stronger institutions than Mexico. So the idea of limit, I don't know. I mean, it's a
it's a good question. I'm afraid we cannot answer what happened with Mexico. And in fact, we have been talking with my co-authors that we need to do this for several countries, and maybe the next version will address the issue. But coming out with capital stock series is not easy, so that's another issue. But anyway, so going back to the motivation of the paper, because Argentina defaulted when the capital stock was high, and we know that gives motivations for default, we are going to take the stand that it was an opportunistic default, and from thereafter, Argentina ceased to be a reliable country. And foreigners are concerned that if they pour too much money, they're going to be confiscated. Now, a little bit going to your question, Sanjita, the question is, so we're going to have a model with limited commitment constraints, meaning, of course, the foreigners are going to be aware that if we lend these guys too much money, they're going to confiscate it. So we will not give them that much money, and it will be exactly as to satisfy the optimal contract, but not in the way, not enough that they will want to default. And to avoid semantics, we typically when present this paper, they say, oh, there is no default. There is no default in equilibrium in the technical sense, but there is default in the sense that you can think that there is a contract out there, a nominal contract, but foreigners know that in some states of the world, this contract is not going to be honored literally. They are aware of that, so it's a formality. So there is, in some sense, there is default in the sense that you can think a nominal contract was written and is not honored, but that doesn't mean the foreigners were not aware of that. It's just because probably lawyers require you to write contracts in a certain way, and they are not. In other words, no one is stupid in this game. Everyone will know exactly what the incentives are. So by going to where this approach, whether limited commitment constraints are empirically relevant, there are several papers out there. One is by, I'm not sure I pronounced the name correctly, it's Zizunennikov, where he concludes that no, but this model, again, is an endowment economy, no capital. And as I explained before, these tend to bias the results against ours. And also they introduce exogenous cost. He introduces exogenous cost of defaults. We don't play the game. If we did, we could get a lot of mileage out of this paper, but we decided that we are going to stick with the discipline imposed by the model. Maybe it's an answer from Davis, but it's a complete, no, again, it's a model without capital. So we don't know what will happen when capital is introduced in that model. And also it's a complicated model because on top of limited commitment constraints, it has moral hazard and monitoring technology. Then yes, the answer yes is Kehoe and Perry, the old paper 2002, where they have a two-country model and they show that with limited commitment constraints, they can address some counterfactual implications of real business cycle models that don't have the limited commitment constraints included. The more recent one is Paulina Restrepo Echeverria at the St. Louis Fed. Hers is a really computationally complex approach, but is focused on consumption in the low to medium frequencies. And it's not really focused on the dynamics of capital stock, which her model almost by design misses. So, but it's probably the closest to the approach to ours that there is out there. Then finally, it's Gordon and Guerrón and Quintana, but again, they do have capital, but they have to introduce exogenous default cost. There's a typo there. Exogenous default cost to get the results they get. So this paper then differs on almost all the others. First, we have limited commitment constraints, like all of them do, but with capital adjustment costs, no exogenous cost of default. So we're going to ask with this simple question, with this simple model, whether this framework can account for the declining capital stock in Argentina, and also for the way it responded to fluctuations in TFP since the 1980s.
So did you find that the real wage is also going down?
Well, we didn't, again, that goes to the informal economy. 30% or 35% of the labor force, as Sanjita knows, is informal in Argentina. So coming up with a fee for wages is hard. But from my own experience, I can tell you that first of all, GDP has been stagnant for the last 20 years. And from my own experience, I think real wages have really gone down too, as you would expect when the capital stock declines. But we don't have a concrete measure of that.
Can you approximate it by consumption per capita, or not really, or energy per capita?
We could, that's a good idea, and maybe we should add that. The problem is the consumption is calculated as a residual in Argentina, and so we don't have any reliable indication of consumption, but that's exactly Paulina's paper. Paulina's paper addresses consumption, and she shows that she calculated, she has data for consumption, and we are actually not sure how she got them, probably just from the national accounts, and she shows that these limited commitments constraints because actually she also calibrates her economy to Argentina data, and she concludes that consumption fell in the aftermath of that crisis.
Maybe Penn-Ward table should have consumption, no?
We're going to talk about the Penn-Ward tables at the end.
Okay. Could I, in that context, would there be any micro level data that you could use, like living standards data from the World Bank? They have consumption data.
Yeah, but my understanding is that they rely on national sources, and again, the national sources are not that reliable. But there is some work.
There be household surveys.
Yeah, but the household services they have some issues with collecting the data. But yes, that's information, micro information that we could bring into the analysis. And so you're asking because you want to confirm that consumption declined too?
Right.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah, we maybe should have a complement. I'm sure it did from my informal knowledge, but it would be nice if we can present it that formally. Yeah, we'll do that.
And then the real question is who benefited from this stuff, right? Because you need to see what will happen in the future, right? There is some kind of foresight.
Yes, exactly. And we are going to incorporate that in the form of choice-sidedness. So in other words, this is a little bit like Mark Aguiar and others have done that. In these countries, the borrowers, they are more impatient than the lenders. And this impatience just reflects some kind of indirectly some political constraint, some appetite for resources that politicians are looking more at the short run than the long run. But we capture that very crudely as others do in the literature. So, but we don't model explicitly political economy. We just model it as politicians or whoever is making politicians. The population in general, captured by the discount factor, is more impatient than the lenders.
Carlos, will you tell us something about how you constructed the capital stock? Because as you said, that's a hard thing to do. And this is a spectacular graph you showed us. So, I was wondering, because my concern is that we know that the service sector, it's really hard to measure their capital stock. Does this decline just show decades of structural transformation towards the service sector? Or, I guess I'm just rummaging around a little bit to
Yeah, I think, can we go back to that question when I describe how we construct the capital stock?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so now this chart is presenting again, just trying to, the goal of this chart is to relate more accurately the fluctuations in TFP, which we take as exogenous, with the dynamics of the capital stock. So what this chart is showing is the deviations of the trended capital from its average over this period, and the deviations of TFP from its average over this period. So you can see here that the capital stock, not surprisingly, declined during the 1980s along with TFP. So TFP went down and then the capital stock also went down. So, but then you can see the other interesting feature is that in the 1990s, there is a big surge in TFP and the capital stock barely responds. Similar pattern as in the 80s later. There was a big crisis in Argentina. TFP declined along with TFP. And then TFP recovered a lot, but the capital stock didn't. So what we see here is that there is an asymmetric response of the capital stock or investment to fluctuations in TFP. It responds very strongly to negative TFP fluctuations, but doesn't react much to when TFP goes up. And so the reason we think there's some hope to include limited commitment constraints in the analysis is because they will replicate this feature of the data. We will get, as I show, intrinsically the limited commitment constraints will have this property that capital will react strongly to declines in TFP, but not to increases in TFP. And that's even after introducing adjustment cost of capital. So, and the other thing is that when to compound this issue, when you look at the international interest rates in orange, you can also see, especially in this period, in the 2000s, that we have a combination, well, even in the 90s, we have a combination of higher TFP and lower international interest rates, yet the capital stock failed to respond. There's a double whammy here. The TFP goes up and international interest rates go down. You would expect capital stock to surge, but that didn't happen. And the same in the later period, starting in 2000. And so this is, we think that I will see in this, the limited commitment constraint will also have that property, that counterfactually, a lower international interest rate will not increase capital that much, or in fact, it could make it fall down relative to what you expect in a open economy without commitment issues. So, Shohanan, you have a question?
Yeah, Carlos, do you have someone else have a question? I don't know. I have a question. Carlos, do you have data on bonds that are traded in Argentina, let's say junk bonds, that you can find out what is the real interest rate in Argentina? Because when you look at this international, Argentina is a small country relative to, you even treat it as an open, right, small economy. So maybe this is not the relevant number.
Well, I should say that's the reason why we use the Neumayer-Perry real interest series, because it's the interest rate series, the interest rate charge on firms that are not investment grade to emerging markets. So
But in
it's
the
not.
US.
Say again?
But in the US, I'm thinking that you want to look at the interest rate in Argentina of junk bonds, if they have one, I don't know.
Well, but that would reflect the limited commitment constraint, right? That would be an endogenous variable. And that's exactly what I'm going to have in the model. In the model, there will be the domestic interest rate will not be equal to the international interest rate precisely because you want to restrict the flow of capital to the country. So I think we can come back to your question once we see how the domestic domestic interest rate interacts with the international interest rate. Okay, so I need to come back here. So now we're going to move to the model, and I give you an analytical framework. We're talking about a small open economy that is able to borrow from or to lend to risk-neutral foreign investors. We have a stand-in household that will value as consumption streams. We're going to take everything else, labor and population growth, as exogenous. We will have a production function with the standard neoclassical properties. And we have a resource constraint. It's very standard. It will include adjustment cost of capital, but basically it's just production plus capital left from a previous period minus or plus transfers received from foreigners must equal consumption plus the capital accumulated left for next period and enough to pay the adjustment costs. Any question about this framework?
Just a comment, have you tried also time to build other than just adjustment cost?
No, we have not. But if we did that, I think it will. We
make the model more dynamic, right? So.
Well, I think it's as you'll see. I think it's dynamic enough now. But yeah, we haven't done that. We don't want to depart too much from the literature because we want this to be comparable. And I don't think anyone in the literature for these kind of problems has really used time to build. In part because it's hard to calibrate for emerging markets. You know, what is the time to build in Argentina? Could be centuries relative to the US. So let's talk about the lender. The lender discounts the future cash flows at the international interest rate R star. And then there will be a discount factor that is just multiplication of the product of the real interest rate. And so the lender will obtain a present value of this borrowing or this lending and these transfers to and from abroad. And we interpret this present value as the initial debt of the country. So the present value of payments to Argentina and payments from Argentina should equal to the debt at the beginning of our analysis, which is 1980. So we're going to calibrate all this. So what is a feasible contract? A feasible contract will, between the small open economy and the lender, will specify a sequence of transfers to and from abroad captured by BT, consumption sequence and capital stock, such that the lender's present value of the transfers is exactly at least equal to the initial debt. And the important constraint here is that the capital or the investment in the country will have to be from abroad. We have to be such that this small open economy is never tempted to default. And this is measured by the fact that the stream of consumption from staying connected to the world is going to be higher than switching to, or at least higher or equal than switching to autarky. This is what's captured in this incentive problem. If this is very high and this is not high enough, then the economy will default, stop all the payments to foreigners and confiscate. And of course, this is the temptation that the lenders are aware about. And whenever they decide to invest in Argentina, we'll have to have this restriction into account. And again, so this, the value of autarky, of course, is maximization. It's just, the country's autarky, they will maximize consumption given the capital stock. And the consumption in autarky is just given by the resource constraint I presented before, but without any transfers from abroad. Just BT is gone from the autarky. Any questions?
Carlos, what do you know about the lenders to Argentina? Are they US, American? Are they in South American? Is it China?
I mean, we don't have any, my view is, I think is no, maybe international funds that are, I mean, whoever buys mutual funds will buy bonds from Argentina included in the package.
You should get data maybe from foreign direct investment in order to get an idea who are the relevant lenders.
Right, but foreign direct investment is just, here is, you could assume just bonds. You just lend money to Argentina, Argentina will use it, for consumption or for capital. So we leave it to Argentines. It's not necessarily, direct investment will be one form, but it's not the only one. We can think this just as, we're going to lend money to Argentina and not necessarily in the form of foreign direct investment. Then Argentina will decide how to allocate that transfer between consumption and capital. That's the way we are thinking about this problem. And that's why we didn't look particularly at foreign direct investment. And
do you have portfolio investment, or do you think it will help you?
Yeah, probably will help, but we didn't look at those data. We are now, we are going step by step. First, we're trying to see if this model can account for the capital stock, and then maybe other harder questions will come up. So the optimal contract, yes.
Can I ask you, so why don't you have bonds in the budget constraint? I mean, borrowing. So you have sequence, lender specified sequence B, but it's not kind of, is it exogenous or?
Well, no, it's not exogenous because it has to satisfy this constraint. So I cannot lend to Argentina so much that this constraint could be violated because they will have so much capital that they will want to default, stopping the obligations from abroad and just leave out of the money they got from foreigners. So the transfers will be part of the equilibrium. No, it's not exogenous. It's one of the variables that will essentially the trade balance. Once you decide consumption and capital stock, then you know how much output you have, and output minus consumption will give you the borrowing, the trade balance.
Yeah, but I think, for example, in this literature about default literature, like Christina Ariana paper, where you have borrowing and default, and so the borrower decides on B, which is bonds, how much to borrow. No, so in your case, you have capital and this transfers. Would it be interesting also to kind of introduce borrowing in the same way as this default literature does?
Okay. Yeah. Okay, we we are again. So this is the complicated thing I said at the beginning. We do have default, but strictly speaking, there is no default in equilibrium. But there will be transfers from foreigners and to foreigners, and that will depend on the capital stock at each period, because we want to make sure that Argentina is not getting so many transfers from abroad that it will default. So I guess as we go along in the presentation, we'll see how this constraint operates and makes all the other variables take into account.
In reality, is the government of Argentina borrows the money, or is it firms, corporation in Argentina?
No, this is like Quijo and Perry. The government eventually, even if the borrowing is private, once there is capital in the country, the government can seize it and can go and say, oh, thank you, AT&T, for investing all this much money. Now we're going to seize it and we're going to just keep the money. And in fact, Argentina has done that it has confiscated foreign firms. So we don't make that distinction because in this model, the government has the ability to, there is no boundary between private and public capital. That's the underlying assumption. Did I answer your question?
No, I understand the model.
Okay.
You are dumping everything on the government, but my question is, private companies, when they default, that's a different issue, I think.
Well, again, you can think this is an aggregate, and when the companies default, again, there's no default in equilibrium in this model. Everyone understands. So whatever the companies get is exactly what prevents the government from confiscating.
What I'm saying is that maybe you want to tell us or to look at bonds that the government issue, government bonds, sovereign debt, whatever it's called, and debt to corporation, which are maybe doing it on one-on-one. And maybe that affects the dynamic.
Okay.
I don't know, I'm asking.
No, I mean, right now we're not taking this, we're consolidating everything, public and private debt. And we don't address the issue. In order to do that, we will have to introduce some government with some behavior, and that will complicate. Now we have to make assumptions on what the government is doing. And we are just taking here the stand that is a social planner that is allocating resources. And so this social planning in Argentina will decide, well, if I have all this much capital and it turns out that I can give to my citizens a lot of consumption because I stop making payments abroad, then I will essentially go to autarky. And
Carlos, what I'm going after is maybe the missing capital that you find is not as big as, that's what I'm saying, if you will take into account private borrowing or corporation borrowing and government borrowing. And I don't know, maybe you can look at Greece or Portugal or Spain, to see what the ratio,
but this is physical capital. This is actually capital using the production function.
Yeah, but
so
it translates. It's in dollars, right, or whatever.
Yeah, we mean, obviously from the evidence we show, the capital stock has been going down in Argentina. And so whether, the composition, we don't take a stand, but overall it's going down. So with an optical contract, then we have a feasible sequence of these endogenous variables, the transfers to and from abroad, consumption and capital, taking as given population growth, TFP, and the international interest rate and the initial debt. And so we will have in the abstraction of the model, we have the social planner allocating resources to Argentina, taking into account this is the utility function of Argentina. It has to satisfy foreign lenders. So the net present value of transfers to and from abroad must be equal to the initial debt. And it also has to satisfy the limited commitment constraint in the sense that Argentina will never be tempted in the limit to seize all the capital and stop all the payments abroad. So eventually Argentina finds the situation where it has to honor commitments acquired in the past, but it can benefit from not doing so. It will stop paying, and then the value of autarky will be higher than this. And the model will prevent that from happening. That's what the limited commitment constraint does. Basically, this is the action is here in the model. Okay, so I'm not sure I want to go through the details of the first order conditions. I just did it because I know there are grad students in the audience, but you can look at the transparency. And the important thing from the first order conditions is this is the first order condition for consumption, and this is the multiplier on the promise keeping constraint. This is the shadow value of honoring obligations contracted with the foreigners. And so this constraint says, and here this is the multiplier on the limited commitment constraint. So this is basically saying that these multipliers must be such that Argentina, that this multiplier must satisfy this equality, which will determine consumption endogenously. And the interesting thing is that you see that this is a summation here. So suppose for the first 10 periods, these things are 0. Well, then in period 11, the Lagrange multiplier on the limited commitment constraint is positive, meaning Argentina will be tempted to default. Then that immediately means, if you go to the previous equation to here, that means I have to give Argentina more consumption, because otherwise it will default. So every time the multiplier goes up, or the budget, the limited commitment constraint is binding, is going to have the effect of pushing consumption up. On the other hand, that will make the constraint on consumption up. That will make the constraint on the paying back the debt higher too. So these two forces are going to interact in determining the outcome of the model. And then here is the first order condition for capital, where you have, this is at the standard real international interest rate. And the first terms are the standard first order condition you get for models without the limited commitment constraints. The interesting term is this one. Here, there will be some interaction. You see all the things are interacting. The multiplier on the limited commitment constraint, the multiplier on the commitment to pay back the obligations contracted with foreigners, and the value of autarky. I'm going to elaborate a little bit on the consequences of this first order condition later, but I wanted to introduce them early on in the analysis so you're aware that they are coming. So just to illustrate what it does, to bring this down to earth, we are going to use some numerical examples that we are going to assume that the trend that, sorry, this is, no, this is just, I'm going to skip this because this is going to probably slow down things. So in the quantitative implementation, what are we going to do? We have to specify the utility function. So we're going to use the standard constant risk aversion production function, standard Cobb-Douglas consumption function, the standard consumption function, utility function, the standard constant return to scale Cobb-Douglas production function, and we're going to specify this adjustment cost, which is typically done in the literature. And we're going to do all in terms of the trended variables, as is standard in the literature. So you'll see that we are going to switch to lower cases because we're going to trend all the variables by population growth and TFP growth. Just assuming that they are deterministic rates, and we back them out from the average TFP growth and the average population growth between 1980 and 2008.
And one question, how do you know that your model has balanced growth?
Oh, it's a standard neoclassical growth model. So it's only labor augmenting. Well, with the Cobb-Douglas production function, you will get balanced growth,
so
regardless of the source of growth.
Okay, anything from this limited constraints, it does not interfere, so it does not affect the outcomes that the model has balanced growth.
Cool question. It will, all we will do, it will affect the capital output ratio, but not, output and capital will grow at the similar rate. But the limited commitment constraint will have a dampening effect on the capital output ratio. I will see later. So in other words, no, there's balanced growth. Still, we get balanced growth. What we get is balanced growth at the lower capital output ratio. And we'll see in a minute. So the numerical experiments. So the goal of the numerical experiments is to illustrate the asymmetric response of the capital stock. Because as you saw in the plots we presented before, capital stock declines rapidly when TFP falls, but it doesn't climb back when TFP grows. And the point of these exercises is to give you an intuition on how the model is working. So we're going to have here an all perfect foresight. So we're going to have a fully anticipated temporary increase in TFP 5 periods ahead. And then a temporary, that example would be a temporary decrease in 5 periods ahead. And just for this exercise, we are going to use these parameters. Theta will be 1/3. This will be logarithmic utility, and assume no growth and zero there at the beginning. And we're going to have, in the transparent, in the slides, we have consider full depreciation and partial depreciation with adjustment cost. I'm not sure I'm going to cover that, because the point, as I said, is to illustrate how these limited commitments constraint replicate this feature of the data of an asymmetric response of the capital stock to TFP movements. So in order to interpret this numerical exercise I'm going to show, recall that this is the first order condition for consumption, now written in the trended form. That's why we have lowercase letters, but it's exactly the one I presented before. And what this means is that the optimal contract, as I insinuated before, requires to permanently increase consumption going forward once a limited commitment constraint starts binding in any given period T. So you can get that similar insight by working out writing this constraint for 2 consecutive periods. And after some algebra, you get this expression where this is summation of Lagrange multipliers on the limited commitment constraint, but notice that the subindex here is different. This includes one more Lagrange multiplier than the term above. So suppose then that in this example, the limited commitment constraint is only one time it binds, and it's in period Tn+1. So the Lagrange multiplier, this mu, will be positive just at Tn+1. And then with the parameterization of the example, the international interest rate is constant, and the discount factor times the interest rate equals this, basically the growth factor to the coefficient of risk aversion, or the intertemporal elasticity of substitution and consumption. But with this example, of course, this term disappears. Because there is only one Lagrange multiplier, there would be only one positive term here, and it's this one. And then you can see that the minute the Lagrange multiplier is positive, meaning the minute there is some temptation for Argentina to default, then this, of course, is a lower number than 1, meaning consumption with the standard formulation for the utility function with decreasing marginal utility from consumption. That means consumption in period Tn+1 will have to be higher. In other words, this marginal utility will have to be lower than the marginal utility in the previous period. And thereafter, because the limited commitment constraint is not binding, then this term is equal to 1, and then consumption is equal in every period. But remember, it jumped already in period Tn+1. So in other words, in order for this condition to be satisfied, then the minute the Lagrange multiplier or the limited commitment constraint is binding, you will have to give Argentina more consumption. So foreigners will have to make sure that Argentina gets more consumption in order to avoid default. And after that, this increase will be permanent. The increase in consumption will be permanent. And this is what you'll see in the charts here. So As I remember, the numerical example just was increasing the TFP from imperial 5. So this is a 50% increase. And in the first best, of course, foreigners, given that the marginal, that the returns to capital are huge, they will pour a lot of money into the country. And then in the next period, there is no adjustment cost, so the marginal product capital will move exactly 1-to-1 with the international interest rate. So here capital goes up, and the next period when the TFP shock disappears, the capital goes back to the steady state level. Now, this is the in blue. Now, you see what happens with the limited commitment constraint. If I, the social planner, were to give Argentina all this capital without changing consumption, they will have the incentive to default. Because this will be a lot of capital that will not satisfy the limited commitment constraint. So that means the Lagrange multiplier will be positive. And as we saw before, when that happens, then consumption will jump. And relative to the first best, of course, in the first best, consumption will be constant. With beta R equal to 1, consumption will be equal in every period. So what's going on here is that because of the limited commitment constraint, I have to give Argentina more consumption going forward. And the way Argentina is going to do that is going to exploit this TFP, is going to reduce consumption now, and is going to save. So abroad, and then collect money from the, or they will lend the money abroad, or invest it abroad, and then collect the money from those investments to keep consumption higher forever. So this is the effect of the limited commitment constraint on consumption. It will force an increase in consumption relative to the earlier period, but also that won't be enough, because the limited commitment constraint is binding. It means we have to reduce the amount of capital going to Argentina by this much. But you can see that, again, a sharp increase in TFP will, even with limited commitment constraints, we have a big impact on capital. The capital stock will move up very quickly.
I ask you about your anticipated shock. How do you model anticipated shock? So how do you compute solutions taking into account that the shock is anticipated as opposed to unanticipated?
Well, this is a perfect foresight example. So we assume that everyone knows that. So this, in the end, is solving a huge nonlinear equations system. Because all the endogenous variables will have to satisfy certain, sequentially all the equations period by period. And maybe I should have gone to the example where I laid out the Lagrangian multiplier for two periods, but it's perfect foresight. So we're assuming this is just to illustrate again. Is to illustrate how the limited commitment constraint can replicate the asymmetry of the responses of the capital stock to TFP shocks. So we see here that TFP goes up by a lot, and so it does the capital stock with limited commitment, not as much as in the absence of the commitment constraint, but it goes up. But if you look at what happens in the economy where the opposite happens, where TFP declines.
Carlos, what are the units on the consumption?
This is just the production. Sorry, so you go to the production function. You will just the parametric is just the k to the 1/3, and so the capital stock here is 0.18.
No, I'm asking about consumption. This is what GDP ratio. Per capita.
No, this is just, we assume a capital stock of 0.18, and that means, that when you solve the example, this will be just, the production here will be, I think, 0.50 something when you So this is just, you compute the output from this level of capital, and that will give you, so capital to the power of theta will give you output. And then you take into account that you have to remember capital stock goes back to steady state. So you subtract from the capital stock the 0.18, because that was this is an example with full depreciation. So capital stock depreciates completely. You need to, if you want to bring the same amount of capital next period, you will have to subtract from output the 0.18 that you need for investment. And so this is just an abstract number. It doesn't have any particular meaning. It's just to illustrate.
It's not related to consumption per capita or the increase in consumption.
This is all detrended, and so yes. Yeah, so,
okay, outside of trend.
So yes, so it's all detrended, so you can interpret it as capital per person. Yes.
And consumption per person?
Yes. Yeah. Everything is normalized. So yes. But again, I mean, the point of this one is that whether it is there is no growth in this model, in this parameterization. Remember, so there is no growth, so everything will be constant, even if it's not in per capita terms.
But given your number, you can calculate consumption per individual and the capital per individual and so on and so on. But this is not this figure, right?
No, I mean, this is just an abstract example, just with the purpose of illustrating the forces behind the model. So there is no growth or population growth or TFP growth in this example. It's just, the point is trying to show how this limited commitment constraint replicates the asymmetry we saw in the data in the responses of the capital stock to TFP. Just a reminder, what we saw there in periods when TFP shot up, the capital stock didn't respond that high, and the asymmetry is obvious, is apparent here, is that when you have a negative TFP shock, then the capital stock, so the TFP recovers. You can see how TFP recovers, but the capital stock stays very low. It doesn't go back exactly to the previous level. So this is the case of Argentina. It had a big TFP decline, right? And then TFP went back up again, but the capital stock was slow to respond. And why? And the reason is now the roles are reversed. Now, in the previous case, Argentina, given the good PST shock, saved or invested money abroad, and then is collecting the proceeds from those investments. Here is the opposite. Argentina, if you look at, going to your question, Hanan, if you compute the value of output here, you see that Argentina is consuming at this point more than it produces, meaning it's getting transfers or is borrowing from abroad. But that means it will have to pay back in the future. And and this is what the incentive will be. Of course, now, if I give them more capital, suppose I have capital going back to the small open economy without the limited commitment constraint. Now Argentina will say, okay, I'll keep all this capital and I will stop making all the payments abroad. So, and that's why you have to keep the capital stock low. Because if you give Argentina all this capital, given that it has to pay back all this debt, it will say, I'm not paying back, keeping all the capital, and then it will not satisfy the limited commitment constraint. And that's why you cannot give Argentina that much capital in this period. And again, that's why you have a big decline in TFP, and when the TFP recovers, the recovery is very slow. Again, it's because the limited commitment constraint is telling if the capital stock were to recover strongly, then given that Argentina is now having to pay back, it will have the incentives to default. So this asymmetry is a reflection of the asymmetry in the commitment issues. The borrowers, the lenders, don't have any commitment issues. They are willing to pay back Argentina or to give Argentina the transfers agreed by the contract. They are not. So in other words, in the previous case, Argentina is receiving money from the investment abroad, but the lenders will not confiscate that. They will let Argentina have that money. Here, the commitment problems are on the Argentine side. So when Argentina has to pay abroad, then that's where the limited commitment constraint kicks in. So when you introduce adjustment cost, the analysis gets a little more complicated, and I think I'm going to jump that because, but essentially we'll recover these asymmetric problems. And I guess I'm going to summarize that with this chart. If this is now with adjustment cost, in the limited commitment constraint economy, when the TFP falls, in the example we just analyzed, then if you do the calculation, the capital stock falls 7.5%. And if the same shock is positive though, the capital stock only rises 3%. So this is the, again, the reason that this is low is because when the TFP is negative, and that happened in the 1980s, Argentina had to borrow a lot. And then if the capital stock were going to return to what we call the first best, Argentina will have all the incentives to confiscate the capital. And so you have to keep the capital really low to prevent that from happening. And so the bottom line is that the limited commitment constraint seems to have that ability to replicate the asymmetric response of the capital stock to fluctuations in TFP that we saw in the data.
So the TFP growth is like 1.5. This is what you're doing here?
Right, yes. So TFP increased by 1.5. So it goes up by 50% or down by 50%. So the decline and the increase are the same size.
And how did you choose 1.5? This was the standard deviation of the...
No, this is just to illustrate. We are not calibrating anything. Calibration comes later in the talk. This is just to illustrate the properties of the model, the abstract properties. So this is just a numerical example. The type you could give to some undergrad student, or just use this number to see what happens in this economy. It has no correspondence to any actual economy. It's just trying to illustrate numerically how the limited commitment constraint has empirical bite, in the sense that it replicates the aspects of the data we're interested in. And so there is another twist in this story. It's not just TFP. The other thing that it matters is, as I insinuated earlier, is the evolution of the real interest rate. As you remember, when I presented the evidence, we showed that in Argentina, when TFP recovered, the international interest rate also happened to be low. And despite these double whammy forces, the capital stock did not recover. And why is that? Well, in this limited commitments constraint has this property, if you wish, counterintuitive, that a decline in the international interest rate will make the limited commitment constraint worse and will lead to a reduction in the capital stock. And this is again, these are numerical examples. We are assuming that we are plotting for different coefficients of risk aversion, or strictly speaking, different intertemporal elasticities of substitution of consumption. We are plotting the effect of a decline in the real interest rate. So you can see, so here, no, the interest rate will be beta times R will be 1, but a decline in the international interest rate will push it, of course, this way. And you can see that the capital stock for all the parameterizations we use in limited commitment constraints goes down instead of up again. So here in this direction, we have a decline in the international interest rates, and we see the capital stock declining. Whereas in the open economy without the constraint, we'll see of course, the capital stock climbing. This is the standard result, that a reduction in the international interest rate will lead to more capital invested in the country to exploit the larger marginal return to capital. And so this is the standard result. The limited commitments constraint will do is turn that result on its head and say, no, when you have a reduction in the international real interest rate, the capital stock will have to be lower to satisfy this limited commitment constraint.
And Carlos, just to understand, that's because of the lender or from the lender's side, right? Why?
Yes, because, because, then if I give these guys all the capital that imply by this, all this capital, right, then they will default. And so what we have to do is to satisfy two things. First, I have to give more consumption. I will give them more consumption, but not that much capital. So in other words, they will depend on me sending them. So I agree to send them down transfers. So now I'm the foreigner, I'm in control. You cannot really confiscate me because I am sending you the payments. And so I can give you more consumption, but I also keep your capital low. So you don't default in your obligations when it's your time to pay back. That's the intuition. So,
good. You get some empirical support for this. If you looked at this Argentinian spread, the spread would have to move in a very weird way compared to the
I'm trying to look. I'm trying to illustrate in abstract. This is just numerical examples. When we calibrate the economy to actual data, things will get a little more complicated. Right. But I'm trying to illustrate. In fact, these effects, when we go to the data, these effects will be interacting and will not be that obvious. So we are trying to simply inspect the mechanism. In the position of inspecting the mechanism, and then we'll see that mechanisms at work, but these different moving parts will not be obvious once we go to the data. And that's why I wanted to emphasize them at the beginning. But we'll see some action of these things when we go to the actual data.
Carlos, they don't have any collateral?
No, we don't have any collateral here.
No, not you, but in reality, do they?
No, I mean, in the model, we don't have, well, you're saying that Argentina could deposit money in the New York Fed?
Let me tell you my aim. I don't believe that the missing capital is so high. So maybe if there is a collateral, the missing capital will be less because the lender will be able to confiscate some of the amount.
But Shohanan, we're talking about physical capital invested in the country. So what you're saying suggests that then the U.S.
The collateral can be gold in a U.S. bank or whatever.
Yeah, but that doesn't enter in the production function. The gold doesn't enter in the production function. This is capital that enters into the
collateral in order to guarantee that this, I call it bounded commitment rather than limited commitment. But that's the idea, no?
Okay, well, again, when we talk about capital, it's just machines and structures and
I'm talking about gold standing at the Federal Reserve and the wallet of New York Fed as a collateral.
Right. Yeah, but okay. Yes, but
actual that's collateral. I don't know.
Yeah, but that's you can interpret that collateral is emerging from this game. So yes, Argentina will have to, send money and they can send it in gold or, we're trying to look at the capital stock that is used in production. So gold obviously has no role in production function in this economy. So you're thinking more about financial frictions playing a role.
I like your model because there is no asymmetric information and still you get this bounded.
Right, but the asymmetry though is in the commitment. There is commitment on the side of the lenders. In other words, I will not confiscate the gold that Argentina deposits in the but I will stop paying if Argentina decides to confiscate my capital. So the asymmetry.
And I'm not going to seize any shipment or ships that comes from Argentina exporting, I don't know what they export, meat or agricultural commodities. Right?
Yeah, from experience, we know that that's very hard to do. international courts typically will not allow that. In fact, there was a famous episode where they wanted to confiscate the flagship of Argentina Navy, and they couldn't. But anyway, in order to confiscate capital, they will have to invade Argentina, take all the machines and all the wires.
No, there are ships that are coming from Argentina to US.
No, of course, they won't send them, right? I mean, here trade will be limited by the limited commitment constraint. So I know this effect could be a little hard to understand. How come the lower international interest rate can lower the capital stock? And if you go through some algebra, I'm not going to bore you with it. You can read the paper or more details in the slides. You'll come out with this equation where the first part is just the standard equation you get for the first order condition of capital. The real international interest rate will have to be simply equal to the marginal pro capital or the rental price of capital minus the depreciation rate plus 1. So this is the standard result. Now we have this additional term introduced by the constraints, in particular by the limited commitment constraint. So let me walk you through that. So I'm repeating the equation here. So what does this equation say? What is suppose there is a decline in the international interest rate. So this goes down. So in the standard, without, suppose this term is not there, then a decline in the real international interest rate means the marginal product capital has to go down, meaning the level of capital has to go up. That's the standard result. So in the absence of this term, we do get the standard result. The issue is what happens with this term. Once we include this term, that conclusion is modified. Why? Because what is going to be key here, one of the pieces of the moving parts, is that the difference in the marginal utility of consumption in autarky and in the contract is captured by this term. And in good times, when Argentina has good TFP and good capital, the marginal utility of switching to autarky will tend to be lower. And so you can see that this term then will eventually, for an extreme, suppose that makes this term go to 0, that will restore the standard result. Right? So in other words, the tendency will be in good times when there's a lot of capital flowing to the country, the value of autarky will be, the marginal value of autarky will go down. And so this term goes down, or this term goes up, and up to 1, right? So that means that yes, if we were only for this term, we still get the result, the standard result, that the lower international interest rate will lead to a higher capital stock. Lower than in the small open economy, but higher anyway. Now, but the severity of the limited commitment constraint now is captured by this term. And if you, again, some algebra will tell you that this term is equal to this thing after shifting forward the first order condition for consumption. And now see what happens here when R falls, right? When R falls, then it's going to make this constraint more binding, right? This term will be bigger. That means the constraint is even more binding. And then this goes up. So it could be, and it has, in the examples, that was the case, that this term dominates this one. And so as a result, the overall, this term gets very small. If this dominates, we are subtracting a higher number, so eventually this will get lower than 1. And in order to restore the result, of course, this has to be satisfied, then that means I have to increase. If this term goes down, I have to increase this term. How do I increase this term? By decreasing the capital stock and increasing the marginal product capital. So there is this interaction between these two terms, one tending to restore the standard result and one tending to undo it. And so if in the numerical simulations we showed, it so happens that this term dominates. Therefore, it undoes the effect of a lower international interest rate on capital. And if this effect is still hard to swallow, let me go through an example with linear utility. For linear utility, just the intertemporal elasticity of substitution in consumption is 0. Sorry, it's a logarithmic is just the 0, so it's a linear utility. And if then you will see when you work through the algebra that as a result of this linearity, these effects, the two effects I showed, will cancel exactly each other and will restore the result I just showed. That the marginal product capital will be just independent of the limited commitment constraints. So in other words, that means that the two forces that I showed cancel each other. And that's what linear utility. Now, when you have a concave utility function, which is more natural, then the examples we work out suggest that the strength of the limited, when the limited commitment constraint, as I said, will be more binding when the lower interest rate, when the international real interest rate is lower, it will undo the effects on the other dimension of this term. So with some examples we worked, then this term dominates this term. As a result, the capital stock falls when the real interest rate goes down. So again, these are the examples I show here. Now, you can see here in action. These are the two things that are in action here. The force coming from the value of autarky is undone completely by the fact that the limited commitment constraints are now tighter. And so I'm just showing the properties of the model, and now of course you may want to see, well, how this thing operates in the actual economy. We are going to do that. Of course, this is not a theoretical paper. So, but before going to that, I need to introduce some theorem, because in the process of calibrating the model, we have to decide where this thing is going to converge, basically. So we know in any steady state, the capital output ratio will be equal to the capital income share divided by the rental price of capital. And further, we know that in a small open economy without limited commitment constraints, the interest rate will be simply the international interest rate. And so from here, given that we know these parameters, we can infer what is the capital output ratio in the absence of limited commitment constraints. Now, we also know in a closed economy, of course, there is no international interest rate. So these are the two examples: completely open economy and completely closed economy. In a completely closed economy, the capital output ratio is a standard, is going to converge to whatever this rate, the domestic rate is in a steady state. So in terms of the propositions, we showed that if the international interest rate is has a limited is equal to 1 plus. You can simplify thinking beta r equal 1. Then the economy will converge to the first best in the long run, and the limited commitment constraint will only have effects in transitional dynamics. But if that thing happens to be less than 1, and then in the long run, the limited commitment constraint will converge to the capital output ratio of the closed economy. And so as a corollary, when we calibrate, we use the capital output ratio in the data, we calibrate them, and we have to check whether that implies this condition or this condition. And if the capital output ratio implies that R beta is less than 1, then we have the result that in the long run, with the limited commitment constraint, the economy will converge to the same capital output ratio as in the closed economy. In the absence of the limited commitment constraint, it will converge to the standard capital output ratio for an open economy. So we do find in the calibration that this is the case, that the capital output ratio is such that we are in the case in which the capital output ratio with limited commitment will converge in the long run to the closed economy capital output ratio. So that's the preliminary to just decide how to calibrate the model. So let's go now to the construction of the capital stock. I think that's some point that Sanjita raised at the beginning, and also like the questions from the grad students. That's a tall order. There is typically no official series of the capital stock for most Latin American countries. So we had to construct it with the perpetual inventory method. And luckily for Argentina, believe it or not, we have series that go back in time. So if we start, they go back to 1900s, in fact. So you can start iterating on the perpetual inventory method and with different depreciation rates. And then you construct the capital stock period by period. Now, in this particular case, we chose, for this particular data I showed you, we constructed the capital stock adopting the same methodology as the Economic Commission for Latin America, which assumed that there's residential structures last for 50 years, that non-residential structures last for 40 years, and machine and equipment have a useful life of 15 years. After those useful lives, they disappear from the stock. And what we use is like sort of a hybrid of a linear and geometric depreciation rate. We apply the depreciation rate that is implied by this equation. So the useful life of each asset, if you use this, this will be linear, but instead we assume that it will be a depreciation rate that will evolve over time until the capital reaches its useful life, and then after that is retired from service. So this is a particular methodology, and as all methodologies, it comes with drawbacks. We are working with a different methodology, more in line. In fact, I should say, this is a methodology that the Bureau of Economic Analysis used until the early 2000s. Then they switch. And so this methodology is comparable to the one that was used like 20 years ago here, but we are working with a more modern version, where it's more closer to the one to the updated one that the BEA introduced in the 2000s, and we are getting basically the same results. So, and also
Carlos,
someone mentioned—
Carlos, one thing is that you have about 10 minutes to finish.
Yes, okay.
And
yes,
my question is about this machinery and equipment. If I will reduce it to 5 years, just by, in my imagination, how good it will be to reduce this missing capital? Do you have an idea?
Say again, what's your question, Johanan?
Let's assume machinery and equipment depreciation or lasting only 5 years rather than 15, because it seems to me low, given too long. Because we have computers today and all of this stuff that we don't know what to do with them. I think in every university they change even the tables and the chairs after 4 or 5 years. So my question is this is important as far as reducing this huge missing capital, because you will have this capital, you know,
last fewer periods.
Right.
Yes, correct. We were worried about that, and that's why we switched to the new methodology. And unfortunately, we didn't have time to incorporate the results, but believe it or not, it gets worse. The capital stock declines even more. And precisely because of your observation that the machine and equipment lasts much less, and there was not enough investment to compensate for that. So yes, and again, this goes to the subtleties of, and in fact, if you all we can do is do a sensitivity analysis. So we did it with this method, with the more updated BEA method, and with the Penware tables, and in the 3 cases, we get the same results. Okay. So it doesn't seem to depend heavily on how we construct the capital stock. More important seems to be the depreciation rate and the path, the trajectory of the international real interest rate. So I mean, we had to stop in 2008, and we have here a disclosure saying that, you know, the World Bank said, you know, after 2008, we don't know what the national accounts of Argentina look like because they mess up so many aspects of it that's why we stopped in 2008. That's 12 years ago, but I think that also tells you Argentina has serious problems, cannot even put national accounts together. So going to the benchmark calibration, now finally bringing it down to the data. No, some parameters are not calibrated. We take them as standard in the literature, the intertemporal substitution of 2, the income share, we assume is 0.4. There are some early numbers from the 80s in Argentina that say that the labor share was about 57%, meaning 0.4 for the capital income share is not that far. Then the depreciation rate is implied by the method we just showed. Then TFP growth and population growth, again, are determined by the data in this period. And then we take the average capital output ratio for the period we're interested in, and it's 1.7, which implies a beta, a discount factor of 0.16. And then we take you saw that the real interest rate, we took this non-investment grade interest rates from Merrill Lynch. And if you now infer what is the value of beta implied by these parameters, you will see that this condition we talk about is, it tells you that the beta times R is 0.994, which is lower than this, meaning then that in the long run, the economy will converge to the capital output ratio of the closed economy. So when we use the numerical method, of course, we have to introduce that into the parameters. And then we calibrated the adjustment cost to make investment in the model as volatile as in the data. And so this is a parameter that is calibrated iteratively. We assume some parameter, see what the model predicts, and keep going until we match the volatility of investment in the model and in the data.
Carlos, you have 5 minutes.
Yes, I'm getting there. So in the simulations, this is perfect foresight. So we're going to feed all this data, the TFP and the real interest rate, exogenously. And this is what we get. So this is the fluctuations of TFP. Here you see, in red dots, show you the periods in which the limited commitment constraint is binding. And you compare now the model. The model with limited commitment constraints is in red, and the data are in black. And the blue line is where what the dynamics of the capital stock would have been in the absence of a limited commitment constraint. And you can see here how the model captured this asymmetry, that in the data, the theoretical asymmetry, when TFP falls in the 80s, capital stock in the model and the data fall almost exactly in sync. Now, when TFP recovers, of course, in the economy without the constraint, it recovers strongly. But in the economy with the constraint, it doesn't recover that much. It's just this, it recovers, but not as much as it should given the TFP. Then again, in this following period, when TFP declines, we see the model, the capital stock declining in the model as much as in the data. There's a level difference, but the slope is about the same. And then again, TFP goes up, but and in the economy without the constraint, that means capital stock will really increase strongly, but it barely moves in the limited commitment constraint. So you can see in the data in action the mechanisms we described before, but you cannot completely see all the actions. It is also the, and then you can see that the model is capable of accounting for quite a bit of the discrepancy between these two. Maybe in this period, not that much, but with the new data, actually it will be all the way through. So the new data just reinforce this conclusion. In fact, it makes it even more dramatic. And so that means it doesn't matter how we contract the capital stock, it seems that these effects are dominating, are still operating. And so,
okay, Carlos, 1 minute for
yes.
summary, so the student may ask question and maybe.
Yeah, and this is the last slide. In fact, I wanted to show the effect of the real interest rate, international interest rate going down because it wasn't obvious in the other slide. So what we did here, this experiment. Now this is the actual real interest rate. We assumed that it was high at the 1990s and stay there, and we replicate that the simulations with this new assumption. And you see here the benchmark is in the dark red. So this is the line I showed you before. In light red is the simulation assuming that the real interest rate is higher. And you can see in this period, particularly this period, the capital stock goes down. And this is the period where the interest rate is lower than in this simulation. So this shows you that there is some effect of the international interest rate operating in a counterintuitive direction. It lowers the capital stock relative to a situation with a higher interest rate. And again, so both, you may say it's not significant, but this is just a numerical example given the calibration, but in other setups or for other countries, it could be more important. We don't know that. But I think, let me finish then for a dramatic picture that we discussed. Sorry that this is not very, it's a sloppy chart, but this shows you basically the result I showed before. With the limited commitment constraint, the economy in the long run will converge to the closed economy capital output ratio. If you lift the limited commitment constraint, the capital output ratio jumps considerably, almost doubles or doubles. That means also real wages will go up, according to some calculations we did, like 30% or more. So this shows you all the advantages that Argentina will have if miraculously it could remove this limited commitment constraint. If suddenly Argentina became a credible country, it will jump from this capital output ratio to this one. And I guess, Johanan, my time is up. So
yes, yes. So student who prepared or faculty.
So I think, so Carlos, what I would find very convincing as evidence of this mechanism is if I could see something similar in the case of all sovereign defaults. That do countries with sovereign default at some point in their life, in general, do we see this decline in capital stock? This is very, very dramatic.
I agree, and we have been discussing. We have been discussing with Finn and Marek that exactly that. We need to do that for different countries. Because remember, we're really not taking a stand. We are not saying limited commitment constraints are the way to go. We are saying, look, for the case of Argentina, it does a great job. It does a great job at accounting for the capital stock. Now, to be fair, there are some limitations. Of course, you know that limited commitment constraints typically produce a counterfactual trade balance. That's true of this model. And even, and then when you try to map, and I think I'm going to Johanna's question, when you try to map the Lagrange multipliers equivalent to a risk premium, we don't get it right all the time. We get it fairly well for the 2000s, but we don't get it quite right in the 1990s. So we still have to work that dimension of the data. The question is whether we have to dump the limited commitment constraints because it cannot account for those dimensions of the data, or whether we need to introduce some tweak to it that will make it work also in the other dimensions. That's a question for future research that we don't answer with this paper. All we want to show is that this is not, you cannot say this is not the way to go. Maybe it still is.
Okay, Marek, do you have any comments on the paper?
No, not right now. Thanks for asking.
Okay, good. Finn, what about you? I'm putting you on the spot.
I would like Carlos to be able to, if he had some concluding comments, I would leave that to Carlos.
Yeah, I do have some concluding comments. We, as I know, maybe I should, this will emphasize also that we are not explaining everything. Okay, that good. Also proves, that also makes this a good model, right? It doesn't explain everything because remember, we are not fitting parameters here. We're taking a steady states and we're seeing what happens. So this is not fitting the data. So what we found is that limited commitment constraint in a small open economy as calibrated for the case of Argentina can explain why the capital stock declined in Argentina starting in the 1980s. Okay, but good. No, we need to confirm that. And then the question is, can this allocation be decentralized? It can, but we have to explore that further. And as I said, it produces a counterfactual, contracyclical, counterfactually produces a positive correlation between output and net export ratio. And so we could use several tricks on the literature. And again, the calibrated parameters suggest that the real wage gains will be huge from regaining confidence. And one thing I didn't mention, again, we ideally would like to find that the limited commitment constraint produces a domestic interest rate that matches the risk premium we see in the data. We have tried, and we have only partial confirmation of that. We need to work more on that. That's an aspect of the model, and maybe introducing some of the things you suggested, Johanna, could help, because this is not the full story. We agree on that.
Okay, good. Now let me ask the director of the program, Professor Christos, to say a few words.
Thank you, Johanna. Well, Carlos, Finn, Marek, I'm Christos Giannikos, and on behalf of the program and our students and faculty, I wanted to thank you very much for the presentation. We're really honored and delighted to have you with us.
Great. So thank you, everyone, for joining in. Could you not share your screen anymore?
Yes, right.
So we can see everyone. I would like to thank everyone. And again, you will hear about maybe a potential meeting with James Heckman on the 23rd of December, once he will get his group from Denmark to join him and our Miles. Thank you very much for coming. I would like to thank Finn Kydland. I would like to thank Carlos Zarazaga, I'm sorry if I mispronounce you, Marek Kapička, and of course, Christine, who did a lot of work, and I didn't know about Lilian connection to Finn, and again, I'm sure we learned a lot from this presentation. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Johanna, for having us. These things are important to expose what we do to the more wider audience. So any one of you who feels that want to make comments, please.
Why do you call it limited rather than bounded commitment?
It's a standard used in the literature.
I see.
I guess, Marek, you can respond.
You should open a new path rather than,
Yeah, I mean, the standard term is limited commitment or limited enforcement. So we didn't want to invent new terminology here.
especially when you go to Utopia, not Utopia, but autarky as a equivalent. In any case, thank you very much. It was a great semester. Hopefully we all agree, because we had, I think, 11 visitors and Nobel laureates and others that really improve our understanding. So that's one of the benefits of the Zoom, how to make a lemonade out of a lemon. So thank you, everyone, and I will be in touch with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you again. Bye.
Thank you, Hanan. Bye.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, Finn, so go back to me in a day or two about the Spanish story.
Oh.
I'm trying to stop recording, but I don't.
Yeah, no, okay. I thought I was supposed to click on the leave, but I haven't actually left you, I guess. And so I would, that's the first thing I'll do now that we're done with this meeting. I will take a look, and what I remember is they want something about
importance of environment,
sustainability.
Yes, absolutely.
And now the challenge I have is if they want a recording, I have no idea how to do that. But if
we
it's
can
only
do Zoom, we can do Zoom, and then it will save you when you talk. I think we can do.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there was a case a couple of months ago. I did an event for the Copenhagen Consensus Center, and they wanted a 4-minute recording, which Tanya, unlike me, I have only a flip phone, but Tanya has a smartphone, and she was able to record up to just under 4 minutes. So that might work, but
yes. So Tanya and I can help you set it up.
I'll get your help.
Yes, no problem. Good. So we'll be in touch, I assume tomorrow afternoon or something.
Yep. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Christos, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Finn. It was an honor to have you. Thank you, Johanan.
Sure. Finn, you need to click on the end to the right, bottom right. You see, it's in red. Well, I can stop it. See you guys.
See you.
See you.